fourth of the 338 clinicians who completed the survey got that version, and we randomly picked who got which version. And about a quarter of the clinicians got the same survey, but we asked them to answer the questions about a moderately physically abused children. And we gave them definitions of what severe and moderate was to make sure that we were anchoring them the way that we wanted to. And then about a fourth of them got a survey where we asked them to think about severely physically abused children in general. Don't think about any particular child, just think about them in general. And then the final version of the survey was to think about moderately physically abused children in general. And this was because we really didn't know whether there would be differences in the ratings of the children's behaviors based on whether they were thinking of a specific child or a general child, or children in general. And you know, when you're researchers, many people here are, you know, you're always thinking end game, how am I going to get this published? What are the reviewers going to complain about? And whether you care about that or not, you just build it into your survey or your research project so you can just sort of, you know, just sort of tick those boxes for them, right? Because I'm a reviewer for many, many journals. I know you sort of put on your critical hat when you're reviewing. Jennifer's nodding, yes. And you sort of, well, it could have been better if they had done this or that. So you sort of want to make your life easier as the researcher. So we didn't have any specific theory about why it would be different to rate children in general or a specific child, but why not just build that into the survey, right? So we're sort of controlling for what could be a potential problem. Okay, so every clinician got the survey and they answered the 18 questions, right? There's 9 items about the child's attachment enhancing behaviors. They care about the relationship. They care about the feelings of the parent. They want to maintain the relationship. They don't see the worst in that parent. They don't always, you know, take the other parent's side, right? And then 9 items are about behaviors that would disrupt that relationship, showing that they didn't care that much about the abusive parent. They weren't invested in the relationship. For each of the 18 questions that we asked the clinicians to fill out about the child or children that they were rating, they could answer never, rarely, sometimes, very often, and always. All right, so every of the 18 items was, they checked a box, either 0, 1, 2, 3, or 4. Never, rarely, sometimes, very often, or always. And I confess, if I had to do again, I would probably change the scale because nobody does anything always, right? So I sort of made it hard to really get items at the top end. Okay. So here are the findings. The first thing we did was we summarized the scores on the 9 attachment enhancing items. So I'm calling them AE, attachment enhancing. And when I summed them, the first thing you do as a researcher, if you're going to sum items on a scale, is you have to sort of prove that you're allowed to do that the items are measuring the same thing. And so you do that with you calculate the alpha coefficient, and it was 78.78 for the sum of the attachment enhancing behaviors, and it was 0.68, whoops, the dot's in the wrong place there. Just mentally move that little period over 2 spaces. It's not 68, it's 0.68. That's the sum of the attachment distancing behavior. So that basically means we're allowed to add up the scores for each clinician's ratings and have a score there of the sum of the 9 that are attachment enhancing and the sum of the 9 for attachment distancing. So the hypothesis is that the even abused children will be rated as exhibiting more what? What's the hypothesis? More attachment enhancing behaviors, right? That's the theory of bonded to the abuser, right? That I was talking about yesterday. That even abused children are invested in the relationship with an abusive parent. They love that parent. They don't want to forego that relationship, and they're going to do things to make it possible for them to still have a relationship. So that includes, for example, blaming themselves for the abuse. And this is something that people who do therapy with abused kids talk about all the time, how hard it is for abused kids in general to say, you know, mom was bad when she hit me. They say, I was bad, it's my fault, I provoked it, I'll just be a good boy or good girl, and then this won't happen again, right? Another one of the attachment enhancing behaviors was minimizing the impact of the abuse. Oh, it wasn't so bad. It didn't hurt that much. It's not that big a deal. So those kinds of attachment enhancing behaviors make it more likely that the child will still feel connected and close to that parent, even when that parent is hurting them. Does that make sense? Okay. You know, I wish I had a copy of the survey. That's a great question. We talked about, so the 9 attachment enhancing were sort of being invested in the relationship, seeing the good in that parent, having realistic complaints about the parent, minimizing the impact on themselves, blaming themselves. So if anybody wants the survey, well, actually, this paper's now been published. I think the items are in the actual paper that's been published, but if anybody wants the actual items, they can contact me. Okay, so our hypotheses were supported. Okay, so the mean attachment enhancing score for the severely abused children who were rated specifically was 19.6. And the mean for the attachment distancing was 11.5. The t-value is 9.5. And the 3 little asterisks means that this was statistically significant at the p-value of 0.001, which means only one time in 1,000 would you find these results by chance. And that's well above the standard that researchers use. Generally, it's 5 in 100. And you say, okay, we believe this is solid. We're going to take this for real, not just random. Okay, so not just, this wasn't just 5 in 100 or 1 in 100, it was 1 in 1,000. Okay, and that's true for all 4 of the subsamples. So the moderately abused children, also the mean attachment enhancing behaviors is much, much, much higher than the mean attachment distancing behaviors. So for the severely abused specific, the clinicians, so roughly, let's say 90 clinicians, were rating a specific child. They were thinking, you know, little Jimmy Smith, you know, I'm going to think of him when I answer this survey. The general was, I'm thinking of all the physically abused children, severe, let's say, all the severely physically abused children that I worked with, and I'm going to rate them. Mm-hmm. No, this was, okay, so the question was, is this a study in which we look at the divorce scenario for the kids? And the answer is no. The only background information we have on the kids for the specific children, because if they're rating in general, they can't answer, is the age and gender of the child. So for each of the 4 samples of clinicians, when they were thinking about the behaviors of the children or child that they were rating, their observations show that the abused children are much, much more likely to behave in a manner that supports the relationship with the abusive parent than doesn't support it or distances. Okay, so another thing we did was I took each child's score and I subtracted the attachment enhancing from the attachment distancing score. Okay? And if the resulting score was positive, it meant that that child was rated as exhibiting more attachment enhancing behaviors than attachment distancing. If the score was 0, it was even. And if the score was negative, it meant that there was more attachment distancing than attachment enhancing. And you can see the vast majority of children are rated as being more interested in the relationship than not. Okay, so interestingly, the ratings did not vary based on the severity of the physical abuse. So the clinicians who were rating, for example, specific specific severely abused child and a specific moderately abused child, there was no differences. And likewise, generally physically severely abused children and generally moderately physically abused children, no differences. There were differences between the ratings of kids in general and kids specifically. And I just don't really have lots and lots of thoughts about that, why that would be. I think it's interesting. In general, the scores were more extreme when people were rating kids in general than when they were rating a specific child. And the only sort of, I know it's a bit of a head scratcher, I sort of think maybe if they're thinking of a specific child, they sort of like that child and they don't want to see them as behaving, you know, in too bad a way or something. But I just don't really know why that would be. But it makes me glad we collected the data that way, so we can sort of control for that. You know, another thought I have, and we do write about this in the paper, is that when they're thinking of a specific child, they might be thinking of a child closer to the end of therapy, because that would be like the recency effect. And so maybe at that point, the kids have sort of progressed through therapy and their feelings are more sort of reality-based or something. So, and I do think that if we were going to replicate the study, it would be really interesting to ask them maybe at the beginning of therapy and then at the end and see if there's some progression there. Okay, so, you know, why do we care about this? Steve, who's going to step up in a minute, right? In 1 minute. Yeah, hold on. He's going to link this to alienation, which is sort of, I think, kind of obvious where we're going to go here. But just thinking about it in terms of people who work with abused children, not thinking specifically about parental alienation. Somebody's phone, and it's mine. Oh, how embarrassing. Never mind. Okay. So I think that a lot of abused children, from what I've read, I'm not a clinician, I don't work with abused children myself, but a lot of what I've read is that it's really, really hard for them to come to terms with how bad their parent has treated them. And I think that if they can, and I think that some of them actually feel shame at feeling so loving and devoted toward this parent who's treated them so badly. And I think just knowing if clinicians can share this information in, you know, appropriate ways with their clients, I think it might help them. Do you have a question or you're stretching? Well, our definition of severe, I mean, you know, because you helped me come up with the definition, was, you know, we gave a definition of what severe abuse was, which was, you know, like leaving, you know, burning and beating the child. So I think that with therapy, some of these kids are encouraged to have more realistic assessments of the abusive parent, and I think that's a good thing. But I think this data can help kids not feel ashamed of still loving a parent who's treated them badly. And because I want to give Steve his time, I'm going to end. And I'm going to let Steve take over and talk about why this matters for parental alienation.
Well, just to use the time, I'll start by saying thank you while Tom sets things up. I think Tom has been an unsung hero here, and I think everyone should give him a good round of applause. Thank you, because I am so grateful, and I have to tell you, at, what was it, 4 in the morning, I said, here, I just made a few changes. Please use this instead of the one I sent earlier. You know, so he's been very patient with everyone, especially probably me. Okay, so Amy, I think, set this up beautifully. Now, so what? I actually took an exam in college, and it was an essay, and when we got there for the midterm, the question was, so what? And we were told, if you write for an answer, that's what, you will fail. So I'm going to zip through slides, but I made the slides more detailed than I intend to cover because some people are going to want to go through this. And there are some statistical concepts to prove what we want to prove. Let me jump in, but just don't feel bad if you're not getting it. It's not that mathematical, but it's slightly mathematical. First, I just want to show you the 8 manifestations. I won't read you the slide. I'm guessing everyone here knows what they are, but seem like if you're going to get the slides later and print them, maybe you should have that somewhere. Otherwise, page 62 of Amy's book, Working with Alienated Children and Families. A little bit of a science lesson. There's a point here. In 1846, the guy on your right, Urbain Jean-Joseph Le Verrier, I think, perhaps I should say, oui, oui, d'accord, j'aurais dû dire Verrier, calculated that there must be another planet beyond Uranus. Uranus wasn't following the orbit it should follow according to Newton's laws. And he said there's got to be another influence. Do you see the analogy yet? And something is influencing the behavior of Uranus, and there's got to be a body, and he calculated exactly where it would be, and like in one day they looked for it and they found it. Okay, a few points. This is 19th century science. So when I hear a judge say, I don't see how you can, claim the mother's been influencing the kids when you've never seen her actually do it, that's not how science works. And if you don't understand the calculations, how Le Verrier did this, take my word for it. It can be done. And by the same token, take my word for it, these can reflect the behavior of the parent, even though you're only looking at the child. Going forward, even Sherlock Holmes knew that. My point being 19th century science, Your Honor. In solving a problem, this is from the very first Sherlock Holmes story. I think I gave this yesterday, so I'll make quick work of it. In solving a problem of this sort, the grand thing is to be able to reason backward. That is a very useful accomplishment and a very easy one, but people do not practice it much. Well, we're using this principle. It's a 19th century principle. My dear Watson, you as a medical man are continually, different story, you are continually gaining light as to the tendencies of a child by the study of the parents. Don't you see that the converse is equally valid? I have frequently gained my first real insight into the character of parents by studying their children. I repeat, a 19th century understanding in medicine. Conan Doyle, of course, was a physician. Now, how do we know that the 8 manifestations are accurate and reliable? Well, you have to break that down into what their detection rate would be, sensitivity, the pickup rate, and how specific they would be. Only, do you only see these with an alienated child, or might you see it with a non-alienated child? And if you see it with a non-alienated child, then you have a false positive. And then in medicine, or any other field, but I'm a doctor. So in medicine, you have to decide what your test is. Are we going to require all 8? Well, that's not realistic. What if there is no extended family? Are we going to require 7 to call it a positive? And you know what? Great example. Prostate-specific antigen, the PSA test, technically we consider 4 to be the number, right? But that's nonsense. It could, if all that means is that's the sweet spot for false positives and false negatives and true positives, right? But if your number is 0.5, that's even better evidence you don't have cancer. And if your number is 8, well, I'm a lot more worried, even though that could be a benign prostatic hypertrophy. So it's a sliding scale. We're not married to the number 4. Anyone who knows how to interpret laboratory data, or for that matter, any type of diagnostic test data, would know that. Unfortunately, a lot of people trying to interpret in this field don't know such things. So, moving along, I'm going to jump a little bit ahead with a few words on that, but I kind of just said it. Sensitivity is the detection rate Technically, it's the true positive rate. We didn't look at sensitivity. And the reason we didn't do that is very important, but we didn't need to either. No one's debating whether the test is sensitive. No one who understands anything is saying, you know, I have a lot of children who I think are severely alienated and they don't have any of these manifestations. That's so crazy, or as Bill might say, nutty, because that's almost the definition of an alienated child. So I don't have to worry about sensitivity to get accuracy. And accuracy is going to be a combination of the detection rate and the false positive rate. So we're going to use the historical controls and expert consensus that this is not our problem. We're going to assume that it's highly sensitive. I don't need to know how high. Is it missing 1%? Is it missing 5%? I don't think it's missing almost anything, but that's just my opinion. So we got that covered. Specificity is where, if there is a controversy, and if you're not willing to take the data before we have this new data, then it's all about specificity, which is a bad term because it doesn't quite mean what it sounds like it means. Technically, specificity is the true negative rate. Let's think about that. How do you establish a true negative rate? There's only one way to do it. Take a whole group of people who are negative. If you want the true negative rate for mammography, you need a lot of women who have a tumor, a lump, but we know it's not cancer. How do we know? Well, it already came out and all of them were negative. Got 100 women, they do not have cancer. How many false positives do I have with mammography? We know that number. It's 6%. It varies a little depending on the radiologist, by the way, how good the radiologist is. It's about 6%. So it's a simple relationship. You see the bullets in the middle. They have to add up to 100. I got 100 people with no cancer. If it accurately identifies 94 of them as being correctly a true negative, then the other 6 are the false positives. That's what we did here. We assumed that our population of well, I'm going to show you the numbers, but the therapists reported back to us on 17,733 children. And we made the simplifying assumption that they're not alienated. Now, how can we do that? Well, by definition, we don't characterize a child as alienated if the child has had the crap beat out of him by the rejected parent. So it's a safe assumption. And I should slip in for any of you who are not scientists, nothing can ever be false that is true by definition. By definition. Okay. So what we wanted to do is further enhance, Amy used a great phrase, I don't know, sort of an iced the cake kind of phrase, to put this controversy to rest. So the people who stand up and say, oh, the evidence isn't there. For one thing, that's not how you determine such things. You don't go out and do you sort of do, but once you know that something has some weight, you can't discard that kind of evidence. So this is what we focused on. As I just said, you have to define what positive means. Do you need all 8? Do you need, do we want to call 5, 6, 7, 4 even? Whatever. How many do you want to require? I'm not going to give that answer except to make the analogy to a PSA. The more I've got, the better. But my data might shed some light, our data. Yes. Okay, that's a great clarification, and I'm thanking you very much. So I like the word collectively, and we can, just like PSA, I don't have to use 4 for a cutoff number. The book says I should, but it also says I don't have to. And it also tells me it's sort of a sweet spot, but I might only be interested in reassuring someone, no way you've got cancer. I don't know how, because, it's only 0.1. All right, anyway, moving along. Here are our data. We surveyed 338 clinicians, which represented about an 80% response rate. And look down to the second to the last bullet. They reported back to us on 17,733 kids. Now, this was an indirect measure. We think that's acceptable. We think that the results are so strikingly consistent and impressive that I'm not too worried that someone's going to attack us for using an indirect measure, but it was an indirect measure. If you look more at the middle two bullets, these were physically abused children, and we especially were interested in moderate and severe abuse. And there again is a medical principle. We know any test will be worse at picking up mild cases. Let's go back to the breast cancer. You know, if you got 100 cells there, they're still microscopic. Mammography will never pick it up. We all know that if it's the size of a golf ball, mammography will never miss it. So even things like sensitivity and specificity don't necessarily specify for what, for the little one, for the big one. So we're not interested in the little crap. We wanted to see if we're going to, when we're dealing with moderate or severe, how good is this test? And that's what the first bullet here shows if you want to glance at it. We also, and this is a mistake here, I actually tweaked this at like 4 in the morning, he would tell you. And there's 5 levels. It's actually, look at the second bullet. We asked them to rate the kids in the various 4 groups at 5 levels. It was really never, rarely, sometimes, very often, or always. I was going to sneak that in before I spoke, but didn't want to waste the minute. But we don't care about anything but very often or always. Again, why? Well, kid's not alienated if they do it every once in a while. Gets back to by definition. If the kid is loving 90% of the time and occasionally tells his parent to eat feces and die, that's normal behavior at a certain age, right? So we aren't too concerned about that. We collapsed the data and we got numbers. And here they are. Results confirmed the hypothesis that this would be highly specific. Confirmed it beyond my wildest dreams. Of those children, 17,733, no child displayed by report was reported to display all 8 manifestations. Next bullet. No child displayed 7, 6, or 5, and only 1 or 2 children displayed 4. That's 1 or 2 out of 17,733, a number I hope won't be beyond the grasp of the PA critics. Well, the reason we say 1 or 2 kids, I'll get you in 10 seconds, Bill. The reason for the 1 or 2 kids is a few people didn't answer the question, very few, but we did something to average that numbers because we wanted to deal with integers. It would be not too inaccurate to say only 1 kid, but it was really something like 1.2, was it? Okay, Bill, I'm ready for. That's how many kids they reported back to us about this. Exactly. Wait a second. Well, let Amy answer that, but that's not entirely. Well, at the level of that we are requiring, we have it's a threshold level at the level of very often or always. Okay, I accept the criticism, but I thought I had done a pretty good job of explaining that this was an indirect measure. It was group data in some cases. We combined certain results. I think it does need to be clear. Okay, well, then everyone's heard it could be misleading, and we'll clarify it next time. Yeah, but well, I'm extremely concerned not concerned, but interested in that comment. But we don't have time to discuss it now. I think I would disagree that we're trying to say the results are so clear in terms of these physically abused kids, and we looked at moderate and severe. I'm summarizing, right? And we tried to get someone to tell us, yeah, I see this fairly often, and very often, and we, if you look at all this data, there does not seem to be. No one reported such a kid to us, and there's an uncertainty factor in saying the word reported. Maybe they missed it, maybe they forgot, maybe it was recency effect, as Amy pointed out. But with supposedly we're being, we have an indirect measure of that, roughly that many kids. That's how the numbers added up. Anyway, I don't need that type of precision to come to the practical conclusion that I want to come to. I just want to be able to say it's very specific, or more accurately, it has a low false positive rate. I've assumed on one hand that these kids are not alienated because they're severely abused, and those are by definition somewhat mutually exclusive. Even there's a little fuzziness. I mean, Dad could be beating the crap out of little Susie, and Mom is telling Susie what a bad guy Dad is, but we don't define that as alienation. Maybe Mom should be telling the kid that Dad's dangerous. Anyway, moving along, I do want to finish up. So the last two bullets are important. No one is saying that you should make the diagnosis based on seeing what you see in the child. That's just one more factor. But if you wanted to put a weight on the evidence, the way it's done is with something called a likelihood ratio. And a likelihood ratio, look at the bottom, if the test is positive, then you do a ratio of true positive rate over false positive rate. And we're assuming that the true positive rate is high because that's sensitivity. Where one could more debate it is, what's our false positive rate look like? And all I need to say is it's very low. And if the denominator is very low and the numerator is very high, that's a very high likelihood ratio. I don't really care much whether it's 3, 30, 300, or infinity. They actually can go to infinity. I just need to say that's a pretty specific test. That's all we can say for almost anything in medicine, unless you really want to look at the numbers, and most doctors don't. So it answered the question. And in the middle of this slide is Bayes' theorem. My final odds are going to be my prior, whatever you believe that to be, times this likelihood ratio, and that's high. I think I'm going to stop right there. I'm not trying to say QED, but I think we confirmed our hypothesis. Thank you.
Take prerogative since we have a minute, and I think the clarification could be that when we're talking about the children in general, we talk about it from the clinicians. So no clinician who's rating children in general said that in general children exhibit more than 4. For the clinicians who are rating a specific child, then we can say no child was, and that way I think that would be a more precise way to talk about it.
So let me add back to the PSA analogy that I may decide that I'm impressed with 5 out of the 8 because I got the data to show what I just told you. You might say, or the critics might say, well, screw that. I think I don't trust. How about 8 out of 8? Or 7 out of 8 if there is no extended family. So you can play with the threshold. That's what it's called. You can adjust. Bill's wonderful little study showing that no child, well, the park survey that, identified the children. What was amazing about that is there was no overlap. He put, the threshold, it was 100% accurate with no fuzzy in the middle. If you didn't understand that, don't worry about it. I'm just trying to say that you always take a test and ask where the cutoff level will be, and you can change that.